Chapter 7 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 7. Dartie versus Dartie. The suit, Dartie versus Dartie, for restitution of those conjugal rights concerning which Winifred was at heart so deeply undecided, followed the laws of subtraction towards Day of Judgment. This was not reached before the courts rose for Christmas, but the case was third on the list when they sat again. Winifred spent the Christmas holidays a thought more fashionably than usual, with the matter locked up in her low-cut bosom. James was particularly liberal to her that Christmas, expressing thereby his sympathy and relief at the approaching dissolution of her marriage with that precious rascal, which his old heart felt but his old lips could not utter. The disappearance of Dartie made the fallen consols a comparatively small matter, and as to the scandal, the real animus he felt against that fellow, and the increasing lead which property was attaining over reputation in a true Forsyte about to leave this world, served to drug a mind from which all allusions to the matter, except his own, were studiously kept. What worried him as a lawyer and a parent was the fear that Dartie might suddenly turn up and obey the order of the court when made. That would be a pretty howdy-do. The fear preyed on him in fact so much that in presenting Winifred with a large Christmas cheque he said, "It's chiefly for that chap out there, to keep him from coming back." It was, of course, to pitch away good money, but all in the nature of insurance against that bankruptcy which would no longer hang over him if only the divorce went through, and he questioned Winifred rigorously until she could assure him that the money had been sent. Poor woman! It cost her many a pang to send what must find its way into the vanity bag of "that creature." Soames, hearing of it, shook his head. They were not dealing with a Forsyte, reasonably tenacious of his purpose. It was very risky without knowing how the land lay out there. Still, it would look well with the court, and he would see that Dreamer brought it out. "I wonder," he said suddenly, "where that ballet goes after the Argentine," never omitting a chance of reminder, for he knew that Winifred still had a weakness, if not for Dartie, at least for not laundering him in public. Though not good at showing admiration, he admitted that she was behaving extremely well, with all her children at home gaping like young birds for news of their father, Imogen just on the point of coming out, and Val very restive about the whole thing. He felt that Val was the real heart of the matter to Winifred, who certainly loved him beyond her other children. The boy could spoke the wheel of this divorce yet if he set his mind to it. And Soames was very careful to keep the proximity of the preliminary proceedings from his nephew's ears. He did more. He asked him to dine at the Remove, and over Val's cigar introduced the subject which he knew to be nearest to his heart. "I hear," he said, "that you want to play polo up at Oxford." Val became less recumbent in his chair. "Rather!" he said. "Well," continued Soames, "that's a very expensive business. Your grandfather isn't likely to consent to it unless he can make sure that he's not got any other drain on him." And he paused to see whether the boy understood his meaning. Val's thick dark lashes concealed his eyes, but a slight grimace appeared on his wide mouth, and he muttered, "I suppose you mean my dad." "Yes," said Soames, "I'm afraid it depends on whether he continues to be a drag or not," and said no more, letting the boy dream it over. But Val was also dreaming in those days of a silver roan palfrey and a girl riding it. Though Crum was in town, and an introduction to Cynthia Dark to be had for the asking, Val did not ask. Indeed, he shunned Crum, and lived a life strange even to himself, except in so far as accounts with tailor and livery stable were concerned. To his mother, his sisters, his young brother, he seemed to spend his vacation in "seeing fellows," and his evenings sleepily at home. They could not propose anything in daylight that did not meet with the one response: "Sorry, I've got to see a fellow," and he was put to extraordinary shifts to get in and out of the house unobserved in riding clothes, until, being made a member of the Goats' Club, he was able to transport them there, where he could change unregarded and slip off on his hack to Richmond Park. He kept his growing sentiment religiously to himself. Not for a world would he breathe to the fellows, whom he was not seeing, anything so ridiculous from the point of view of their creed and his. But he could not help its destroying his other appetites. It was coming between him and the legitimate pleasures of youth at last on its own, in a way which must, he knew, make him a milksop in the eyes of Crum. All he cared for was to dress in his last created riding togs, and steal away to the Robin Hill gate, where presently the silver roan would come demurely sidling with its slim and dark-haired rider, and in the glades bare of leaves they would go off side by side, not talking very much, riding races sometimes, and sometimes holding hands. More than once of an evening, in a moment of expansion, he had been tempted to tell his mother how this shy, sweet cousin had stolen in upon him and wrecked his life. But bitter experience, that all persons above 35 were spoil-sports, prevented him. After all, he supposed he would have to go through with college, and she would have to "come out" before they could be married, so why complicate things, so long as he could see her? Sisters were teasing and unsympathetic beings; a brother worse, so there was no one to confide in. Ah, and this beastly divorce business! What a misfortune to have a name which other people hadn't! If only he had been called Gordon, or Scott, or Howard, or something fairly common. But Dartie! There wasn't another in the directory. One might as well have been named Morkan, for all the covert it afforded. So matters went on, till one day in the middle of January the silver roan palfrey and its rider were missing at the tryst. Lingering in the cold, he debated whether he should ride on to the house; but Jolly might be there, and the memory of their dark encounter was still fresh within him. One could not be always fighting with her brother. So he returned dismally to town, and spent an evening plunged in gloom. At breakfast next day he noticed that his mother had on an unfamiliar dress and was wearing her hat. The dress was black, with a glimpse of peacock blue, the hat black and large. She looked exceptionally well. But when after breakfast she said to him, "Come in here, Val," and led the way to the drawing-room, he was at once beset by qualms. Winifred carefully shut the door, and passed her handkerchief over her lips. Inhaling the Violette de Parme with which it had been soaked, Val thought, "Has she found out about Holly?" Her voice interrupted. "Are you going to be nice to me, dear boy?" Val grinned doubtfully. "Will you come with me this morning?" "I've got to see," began Val, but something in her face stopped him. "I say," he said, "you don't mean—" "Yes, I have to go to the court this morning." Already, that damned business which he had almost succeeded in forgetting, since nobody ever mentioned it. In self-commiseration he stood picking little bits of skin off his fingers; then, noticing that his mother's lips were all awry, he said impulsively, "All right, Mother, I'll come. The brutes!" What brutes he did not know, but the expression exactly summed up their joint feeling, and restored a measure of equanimity. "I suppose I'd better change into a shooter," he muttered, escaping to his room. He put on the shooter, a high collar, a pearl pin, and his neatest grey spats, to a somewhat blasphemous accompaniment. Looking at himself in the glass, he said, "Well, I'm damned if I'm going to show anything," and went down. He found his grandfather's carriage at the door, and his mother in furs, with the appearance of one going to a Mansion House assembly. They seated themselves side by side in the closed barouche, and all the way to the Courts of Justice Val made but one allusion to the business in hand. "There'll be nothing about those pearls, will there?" The little tufted white tails of Winifred's muff began to shiver. "Oh no," she said, "it'll be quite harmless to day. Your grandmother wanted to come too, but I wouldn't let her. I thought you could take care of me. You look so nice, Val. Just pull your collar up a little bit more at the back. That's right." "If they bully you—" began Val. "Oh, they won't. I shall be very cool. It's the only way." "They won't want me to give evidence or anything?" "No, dear, it's all arranged." And she patted his hand. The determined front she was putting on it stayed the turmoil in Val's chest, and he busied himself in drawing his gloves off and on. He had taken what he now saw was the wrong pair to go with his spats. They should have been grey, but were deerskin of a dark tan. Whether to keep them on or not he could not decide. They arrived soon after 10. It was his first visit to the Law Courts, and the building struck him at once. "By Jove," he said as they passed into the hall, "this'd make 4 or 5 jolly good racket courts." Soames was awaiting them at the foot of the stairs. "Here you are," he said, without shaking hands, as if the event had made them too familiar for such formalities. "It's Happerly Brown Court 1. We shall be on first." A sensation such as he had known when going in to bat was playing now on the top of Val's chest, but he followed his mother and uncle doggedly, looking at no more than he could help, and thinking that the place smelled "fuggy." People seemed to be lurking everywhere, and he plucked Soames by the sleeve. "I say, uncle, you're not going to let those beastly papers in, are you?" Soames gave him the sideway look which had reduced many to silence in its time. "In here," he said. "You needn't take off your furs, Winifred." Val entered behind them, nettled and with his head up. In this confounded hole everybody, and there were a good many of them, seemed sitting on everybody else's knee, though really divided from each other by pews, and Val had a feeling that they might all slip down together into the well. This, however, was but a momentary vision, of mahogany, and black gowns, and white blobs of wigs and faces and papers, all rather secret and whispery, before he was sitting next to his mother in the front row, with his back to it all, glad of her Violette de Parme, and taking off his gloves for the last time. His mother was looking at him. He was suddenly conscious that she had really wanted him there next to her, and that he counted for something in this business. All right, he would show them. Squaring his shoulders, he crossed his legs and gazed inscrutably at his spats. But just then an old Johnny, in a gown and long wig, looking awfully like a funny rattled woman, came through a door into the high pew opposite, and he had to uncross his legs hastily, and stand up with everybody else. "Dartie versus Dartie!" It seemed to Val unspeakably disgusting to have one's name called out like this in public. And suddenly conscious that someone nearly behind him had begun talking about his family, he screwed his face round to see an old bewigged buffer, who spoke as if he were eating his own words. Queer-looking old cuss, the sort of man he had seen once or twice dining at Park Lane and punishing the port. He knew now where they "dug them up." All the same, he found the old buffer quite fascinating, and would have continued to stare if his mother had not touched his arm. Reduced to gazing before him, he fixed his eyes on the judge's face instead. Why should that old sportsman with his sarcastic mouth and his quick-moving eyes have the power to meddle with their private affairs? Hadn't he affairs of his own, just as many and probably just as nasty? And there moved in Val, like an illness, all the deep-seated individualism of his breed. The voice behind him droned along. Differences about money matters. Extravagance of the respondent. What a word! Was that his father? Strained situation. Frequent absences on the part of Mr. Dartie. My client, very rightly your Ludship will agree, was anxious to check a course, but led to ruin. Remonstrated. Gambling at cards and on the race-course. That's right, thought Val, pile it on. Crisis early in October, when the respondent wrote her this letter from his club. Val sat up, and his ears burned. I propose to read it with the recommendations necessary to the epistle of a gentleman who has been, shall we say, dining, me lud? Old brute, thought Val, flushing deeper. You're not paid to make jokes. You will not get the chance to insult me again in my own house. I am leaving the country to-morrow. It's played out. An expression, your Ludship, not unknown in the mouths of those who have not met with conspicuous success. Sniggering owls, thought Val, and his flush deepened. I am tired of being insulted by you. My client will tell your Ludship that these so-called insults consisted in her calling him the limit, a very mild expression, I venture to suggest, in all the circumstances. Val glanced sideways at his mother's impassive face; it had a hunted look in the eyes. Poor mother, he thought, and touched her arm with his own. The voice behind him droned on: "I am going to live a new life. M.D." And next day, me Lud, the respondent left by the steamship Tuscarora for Buenos Ayres. Since then we have nothing from him but a cabled refusal in answer to the letter which my client wrote the following day in great distress, begging him to return to her. With your Ludship's permission, I shall now put Mrs. Dartie in the box. When his mother rose, Val had a tremendous impulse to rise too and say, "Look here, I'm going to see you jolly well treat her decently." He subdued it, however, heard her saying, "The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth," and looked up. She made a rich figure of it in her furs and large hat, with a slight flush on her cheek-bones, calm, matter-of-fact, and he felt proud of her thus confronting all these confounded lawyers. The examination began. Knowing that this was only the preliminary to divorce, Val followed with a certain glee the questions framed so as to give the impression that she really wanted his father back. It seemed to him that they were "foxing old bagwigs" finally. And he received a most unpleasant jar when the judge said suddenly: "Now, why did your husband leave you? Not because you called him the limit, you know." Val saw his uncle lift his eyes to the witness box, without moving his face; heard a shuffle of papers behind him, and instinct told him that the issue was in peril. Had Uncle Soames and the old buffer behind made a mess of it? His mother was speaking with a slight drawl. "No, my lord, but it had gone on a long time." "What had gone on?" "Our differences about money." "But you supplied the money. Do you suggest that he left you to better his position?" "The brute, the old brute, and nothing but the brute," thought Val suddenly. "He smells a rat he's trying to get at the pastry." And his heart stood still. If he did, then of course he would know that his mother didn't really want his father back. His mother spoke again, a thought more fashionably. "No, my lord, but you see I had refused to give him any more money. It took him a long time to believe that, but he did at last, and when he did—" "I see, you had refused. But you've sent him some since." "My lord, I wanted him back." "And you thought that would bring him?" "I don't know, my lord. I acted on my father's advice." Something in the judge's face, in the sound of the papers behind him, in the sudden crossing of his uncle's legs, told Val that she had made just the right answer. Crafty, he thought. By Jove, what humbug it all is! The judge was speaking. "Just one more question, Mrs. Dartie. Are you still fond of your husband?" Val's hands, slack behind him, became fists. What business had that judge to make things human suddenly? To make his mother speak out of her heart, and say what perhaps she didn't know herself, before all these people? It wasn't decent. His mother answered, rather low: "Yes, my lord." Val saw the judge nod. "Wish I could take a cock shy at your head," he thought irreverently, as his mother came back to her seat beside him. Witnesses to his father's departure and continued absence followed. One of their own maids even, which struck Val as particularly beastly. There was more talking, all humbug, and then the judge pronounced the decree for restitution, and they got up to go. Val walked out behind his mother, chin squared, eyelids drooped, doing his level best to despise everybody. His mother's voice in the corridor roused him from an angry trance. "You behaved beautifully, dear. It was such a comfort to have you. Your uncle and I are going to lunch." "All right," said Val. "I shall have time to go and see that fellow." And parting from them abruptly, he ran down the stairs and out into the air. He bolted into a hansom, and drove to the Goat's Club. His thoughts were on Holly and what he must do before her brother showed her this thing in tomorrow's paper. When Val had left them, Soames and Winifred made their way to the Cheshire Cheese. He had suggested it as a meeting place with Mr. Bellby. At that early hour of noon they would have it to themselves, and Winifred had thought it would be amusing to see this far-famed hostelry. Having ordered a light repast, to the consternation of the waiter, They awaited its arrival together with that of Mr. Bellby, in silent reaction after the hour and a half's suspense on the tenterhooks of publicity. Mr. Bellby entered presently, preceded by his nose, as cheerful as they were glum. Well, they had got the decree of restitution, and what was the matter with that? "Quite," said Soames, in a suitably low voice, "but we shall have to begin again to get evidence. He'll probably try the divorce. It would look fishy if it comes out that we knew of misconduct from the start. His questions showed well enough that he doesn't like this restitution dodge." "Pho!" said Mr. Bellby cheerily. "He'll forget. Why, man, he'll have tried 100 cases between now and then. Besides, he's bound by precedent to give you your divorce if the evidence is satisfactory. We won't let him know that Mrs. Dartie had knowledge of the facts. Dreamer did it very nicely. He's got a fatherly touch about him." Soames nodded. "And I compliment ye, Mrs. Dartie," went on Mr. Bellby. "Ye've a natural gift for giving evidence. Steady as a rock." Here the waiter arrived, with 3 plates balanced on one arm, and the remark, "I 'urried up the puddin', sir. You'll find plenty o' lark in it to-day." Mr. Bellby applauded his forethought with a dip of his nose. But Soames and Winifred looked with dismay at their light lunch of gravified brown masses, touching them gingerly with their forks in the hope of distinguishing the bodies of the tasty little song-givers. Having begun, however, they found they were hungrier than they thought, and finished the lot, with a glass of port apiece. Conversation turned on the war. Soames thought Ladysmith would fall, and it might last a year. Bellby thought it would be over by the summer. Both agreed that they wanted more men. There was nothing for it but complete victory, since it was now a question of prestige. Winifred brought things back to more solid ground by saying that she did not want the divorce suit to come on till after the summer holidays had begun at Oxford. Then the boys would have forgotten about it before Val had to go up again. The London season, too, would be over. The lawyers reassured her an interval of 6 months was necessary. After that, the earlier the better. People were now beginning to come in, and they parted. Soames to the City, Bellby to his chambers, Winifred in a hansom to Park Lane to let her mother know how she had fared. The issue had been so satisfactory on the whole that it was considered advisable to tell James, who never failed to say day after day that he didn't know about Winifred's affair. He couldn't tell. As his sands ran out, the importance of mundane matters became increasingly grave to him, as if he were feeling, "I must make the most of it, and worry well. I shall soon have nothing to worry about." He received the report grudgingly. It was a new-fangled way of going about things, and he didn't know. But he gave Winifred a cheque, saying, "I expect you'll have a lot of expense. That's a new hat you've got on. Why doesn't Val come and see us?" Winifred promised to bring him to dinner soon. And going home, she sought her bedroom where she could be alone. Now that her husband had been ordered back into her custody, with a view to putting him away from her for ever, she would try once more to find out from her sore and lonely heart what she really wanted. End of Part 2, Chapter 7. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Section 26, Part 2, Chapter 8. The Challenge. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnig. The Forsyte Saga in Chancery. Part 2, Chapter 8. The Challenge. The morning had been misty, verging on frost. But the sun came out while Val was jogging towards the Roehampton gate, whence he could canter on to the usual tryst. His spirits were rising rapidly. There had been nothing so terrible in the morning's proceedings beyond the general disgrace of violated privacy. If we were engaged, he thought, what happens wouldn't matter. He felt, indeed, like human society, which kicks and clamours at the results of matrimony, and hastens to get married. and he galloped over the winter-dried grass of Richmond Park, fearing to be late. But again he was alone at the trysting spot, and this second defection on the part of Holly upset him dreadfully. He could not go back without seeing her today. Emerging from the park, he proceeded towards Robin Hill. He could not make up his mind for whom to ask. Suppose her father were back, or her sister or brother were in. He decided to gamble and ask for them all first, so that if he were in luck and they were not there, it would be quite natural in the end to ask for Holly; while if any of them were in, an excuse for a ride must be his saving grace. "Only Miss Holly is in, sir." "Oh, thanks. Might I take my horse round to the stables? And would you say her cousin, Mr. Val Dartie?" When he returned she was in the hall, very flushed and shy. She led him to the far end, and they sat down on a wide window seat. "I've been awfully anxious," said Val in a low voice. "What is the matter?" "Jolly knows about our riding." "Is he in?" "No, but I expect he will be soon." "Then," cried Val, and diving forward he seized her hand. She tried to withdraw it, failed, gave up the attempt, and looked at him wistfully. "First of all," he said, "I want to tell you something about my family. My dad, you know, isn't altogether, I mean, he has left my mother, and they are trying to divorce him. So they have ordered him to come back, you see. You'll see that in the paper tomorrow." Her eyes deepened in colour and fearful interest. Her hand squeezed his. But the gambler in Val was roused now, and he hurried on. "Of course there is nothing very much at present, but there will be, I expect, before it is over. Divorce suits are beastly, you know. I wanted to tell you because you ought to know if—" and he began to stammer, gazing at her troubled eyes, "if you are going to be a darling and love me, Holly. I love you ever so, and I want to be engaged." He had done it in a manner so inadequate that he could have punched his own head. And dropping on his knees, he tried to get nearer to that soft, troubled face. "You do love me, don't you? If you don't, I—" There was a moment of silence and suspense so awful that he could hear the sound of a mowing machine far out on the lawn, pretending there was grass to cut. Then she swayed forward, her free hand touched his hair, and he gasped, "Oh, Holly!" Her answer was very soft, "Oh, Val!" He had dreamed of this moment, but always in an imperative mood, as the masterful young lover, and now he felt humbled, touched, trembly. He was afraid to stir off his knees, lest he should break the spell, lest, if he did, she should shrink and deny her own surrender, so tremulous was she in his grasp, with her eyelids closed and his lips nearing them. Her eyes opened, seemed to swim a little. He pressed his lips to hers. Suddenly he sprang up. There had been footsteps, a sort of startled grunt. He looked round. No one. But the long curtains which barred off the outer hall were quivering. My God, who was that? Holly, too, was on her feet. "Jolly, I expect," she whispered. Val clenched fists and resolution. "All right," he said. "I don't care a bit now we are engaged," and striding towards the curtains, he drew them aside. There, at the fireplace in the hall, stood Jolly, with his back elaborately turned. Val went forward. Jolly faced round on him. "I beg your pardon for hearing," he said. With the best intentions in the world, Val could not help admiring him at that moment. His face was clear, his voice quiet. He looked somehow distinguished, as if acting up to principle. "Well," Val said abruptly, "it is nothing to you." "Oh," said Jolly, "you come this way," and he crossed the hall. Val followed. At the study door he felt a touch on his arm. Holly's voice said, "I am coming too." "No," said Jolly. "Yes," said Holly. Jolly opened the door, and they all three went in. Once in the little room they stood in a sort of triangle on the three corners of the worn Turkey carpet, awkwardly upright, not looking at each other, quite incapable of seeing any humour in the situation. Val broke the silence. "Holly and I are engaged." Jolly stepped back and leaned against the lintel of the window. "This is our house," he said. "I am not going to insult you in it. But my father is away. I am in charge of my sister. You have taken advantage of me." "I didn't mean to," said Val hotly. "I think you did," said Jolly. "If you hadn't meant to, you would have spoken to me or waited for my father to come back." "There were reasons," said Val. "What reasons?" "About my family. I have just told her. I wanted her to know before things happen." Jolly suddenly became less distinguished. "You are kids," he said, "and you know you are." "I am not a kid," said Val. "You are. You are not 20. "Well, what are you?" "I am 20, said Jolly. "Only just. Anyway, I am as good a man as you." Jolly's face crimsoned, then clouded. Some struggle was evidently taking place in him, and Val and Holly stared at him, so clearly was that struggle marked. They could even hear him breathing. Then his face cleared up and became oddly resolute. "We will see that," he said. "I dare you to do what I am going to do." "Dare me?" Jolly smiled. "Yes," he said, "dare you. And I know very well you won't." A stab of misgiving shot through Val. This was riding very blind. "I haven't forgotten that you are a fire-eater," said Jolly slowly, "and I think that is about all you are. Or that you called me a pro-bore." Val heard a gasp above the sound of his own hard breathing, and saw Holly's face poked a little forward, very pale, with big eyes. "Yes," went on Jolly, with a sort of smile, "we shall soon see. I am going to join the Imperial Yeomanry, and I dare you to do the same, Mr. Val Dartie." Val's head jerked on its stem. It was like a blow between the eyes, so utterly unthought of, so extreme and ugly, in the midst of his dreaming, and he looked at Holly with eyes grown suddenly touchingly haggard. "Sit down," said Jolly. "Take your time. Think it over well." And he himself sat down on the arm of his grandfather's chair. Val did not sit down. He stood with his hands thrust deep into his breeches pockets, hands clenched and quivering. The full awfulness of this decision, one way or the other, knocked at his mind with double knocks as of an angry postman. If he did not take that dare, he was disgraced in Holly's eyes, and in the eyes of that young enemy, her brute of a brother. Yet, if he took it, then all would vanish, her face, her eyes, her hair, her kisses just begun. "Take your time," said Jolly again. "I don't want to be unfair." And they both looked at Holly. She had recoiled against the bookshelves reaching to the ceiling. Her dark head leaned against Gibbon's Roman Empire. Her eyes, in a sort of soft grey agony, were fixed on Val. And he, who had not much gift of insight, had suddenly a gleam of vision. She would be proud of her brother, that enemy. She would be ashamed of him. His hands came out of his pockets as if lifted by a spring. "All right," he said. "Done." Holly's face, oh, it was queer. He saw her flush, start forward. He had done the right thing. Her face was shining with wistful admiration. Jolly stood up and made a little bow, as who should say, "You have passed." "Tomorrow, then," he said, "we will go together." Recovering from the impetus which had carried him to that decision, Val looked at him maliciously from under his lashes. "All right," he thought, "one to you. I shall have to join, but I will get back on you somehow." And he said with dignity, "I shall be ready." "We'll meet at the main recruiting office then," said Jolly, "at 12 o'clock." And opening the window, he went out onto the terrace, conforming to the creed which had made him retire when he surprised them in the hall. The confusion in the mind of Val, thus left alone with her, for whom he had paid this sudden price, was extreme. The mood of showing off was still, however, uppermost. One must do the wretched thing with an air. "We shall get plenty of riding and shooting anyway," he said. "That's one comfort." And it gave him a sort of grim pleasure to hear the sigh which seemed to come from the bottom of her heart. "Oh, the war will soon be over," he said. "Perhaps we shan't even have to go out. I don't care, except for you." He would be out of the way of that beastly divorce. It was an ill wind. He felt her warm hand slip into his. Jolly thought he had stopped their loving each other, did he? He held her tightly round the waist, looking at her softly through his lashes, smiling to cheer her up, promising to come down and see her soon, feeling somehow 6 inches taller and much more in command of her than he had ever dared feel before. Many times he kissed her before he mounted and rode back to town. So swiftly, on the least provocation, does the possessive instinct flourish and grow. End of section 26, chapter 8, The Challenge. Recording by Eva Harnick, Florida. Section 27, chapter 9 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Section 27, Chapter 9. Dinner at James'. Dinner parties were not now given at James's in Park Lane. To every house the moment comes when master or mistress is no longer up to it. No more can 9 courses be served to 20 mouths above 20 fine white expanses, nor does the household cat any longer wonder why she is suddenly shut up. So, with something like excitement, Emily, who at 70 would still have liked a little feast and fashion now and then, ordered dinner for 6 instead of 2. Herself wrote a number of foreign words on cards, and arranged the flowers, mimosa from the Riviera, and white Roman hyacinths not from Rome. There would only be, of course, James and herself, Soames, Winifred, Val, and Imogen, but she liked to pretend a little and dally in imagination with the glory of the past. So she dressed herself that James remarked, "What are you putting on that thing for? You'll catch cold." But Emily knew that the necks of women are protected by love of shining on to 80 years, and she only answered, "Let me put you on one of those dickies I got you, James. Then you will only have to change your trousers and put on your velvet coat, and there you will be. Val likes you to look nice." "Dickie," said James, "you are always wasting your money on something." But he suffered the change to be made till his neck also shone, murmuring vaguely, "He is an extravagant chap, I am afraid." A little brighter in the eye, with rather more colour than usual in his cheeks, he took his seat in the drawing-room to wait for the sound of the front door bell. "I have made it a proper dinner party," Emily said comfortably. "I thought it would be good practice for Imogen. She must get used to it now she's coming out." James uttered an indeterminate sound, thinking of Imogen as she used to climb about his knee or pull Christmas crackers with him. "She will be pretty," he muttered. "I shouldn't wonder." "She is pretty," said Emily. "She ought to make a good match." "There you go," murmured James. "She should much better stay at home and look after her mother." A second Dartie carrying off his pretty granddaughter would finish him. He had never quite forgiven Emily for having been as much taken in by Montagu Dartie as he himself had been. "Where's Warmson?" he said suddenly. "I should like a glass of Madeira tonight." "There is champagne, James." James shook his head. "No body," he said. "I can't get any good out of it." Emily reached forward on her side of the fire and rang the bell. "Your master would like a bottle of Madeira opened, Warmson." "No, no," said James, the tips of his ears quivering with vehemence, and his eyes fixed on an object seen by him alone. "Look here, Warmson, you go to the inner cellar, and on the middle shelf of the end bin on the left you will see 7 bottles. Take the one in the centre, and don't shake it. It is the last of the Madeira I had from Mr. Jolyon when we came in here, never been moved. It ought to be in prime condition still, but I don't know, I can't tell." "Very good, sir," responded the withdrawing Warmson. "I was keeping it for our golden wedding," said James suddenly, "but I shan't live 3 years at my age." "Nonsense, James," said Emily. "Don't talk like that." "I ought to have got it up myself," murmured James. "He will shake it as likely as not." And he sank into silent recollection of long moments among the open gas jets, the cobwebs, and the good smell of wine-soaked corks, which had been appetizer to so many feasts. In the wine from that cellar was written the history of the 40-odd years since he had come to the Park Lane house with his young bride, and of the many generations of friends and acquaintances who had passed into the unknown. Its depleted bins preserved the record of family festivity, all the marriages, births, deaths of his kith and kin. And when he was gone, there it would be, and he did not know what would become of it. It would be drunk or spoiled, he shouldn't wonder. From that deep reverie the entrance of his son dragged him, followed very soon by that of Winifred and her two oldest. They went down arm in arm, James with Imogen, the debutante, because his pretty grandchild cheered him, Soames with Winifred, Emily with Val, whose eyes, lighting on the oysters, brightened. This was to be a proper full blow-out, with fizz and port. And he felt in need of it, after what he had done that day, as yet undivulged. After the first glass or two it became pleasant to have this bombshell up his sleeve, this piece of sensational patriotism, or example, rather, of personal daring to display, for his pleasure in what he had done for his Queen and country was so far entirely personal. He was now a blood indissolubly connected with guns and horses. He had a right to swagger, not of course that he was going to. He should just announce it quietly, when there was a pause, and glancing down the menu he determined on bombe aux fraises as the proper moment. There would be a certain solemnity while they were eating that. Once or twice before they reached that rosy summit of the dinner he was attacked by remembrance that his grandfather was never told anything. Still, the old boy was drinking Madeira and looking jolly fit. Besides, he ought to be pleased at this set-off to the disgrace of the divorce. The sight of his uncle opposite, too, was a sharp incentive. He was so far from being a sportsman that it would be worth a lot to see his face. Besides, better to tell his mother in this way than privately, which might upset them both. He was sorry for her, but after all, one couldn't be expected to feel much for others when one had to part from Holly. His grandfather's voice travelled to him thinly. "Val, try a little of the Madeira with your ice. You won't get that up at college." Val watched the slow liquid filling his glass, the essential oil of the old wine glazing the surface, inhaled its aroma and thought, "Now for it." It was a rich moment. He sipped, and a gentle glow spread in his veins, already heated. With a rapid look around he said, "I joined the Imperial Yeomanry today, Granny," and emptied his glass as though drinking the health of his own act. "What?" It was his mother's desolate little word. "Young Jolly Forsyte and I went down there together." "You didn't sign?" from Uncle Soames. "Rather. We go into camp on Monday." "I say!" cried Imogen. All looked at James. He was leaning forward with his hand behind his ear. "What's that?" he said. "What is he saying? I can't hear." Emily reached forward to pat Val's hand. "It is only that Val has joined the yeomanry, James. It is very nice for him. He will look his best in uniform." "Joined the—" "Rubbish!" came from James, tremulously loud. "You can't see 2 yards before your nose. He will have to go out there. Why, he will be fighting before he knows where he is." Val saw Imogen's eyes admiring him, and his mother still and fashionable with her handkerchief before her lips. Suddenly his uncle spoke. "You are under age." "I thought of that," smiled Val. "I gave my age as 21." He heard his grandmother's admiring, "Well, Val, that was plucky of you. was conscious of Warmson's deferentially filling his champagne glass, and of his grandfather's voice moaning, "I don't know what will become of you if you go on like this." Imogen was patting his shoulder, his uncle looking at him sidelong. Only his mother sat unmoving, till, affected by her stillness, Val said, "It is all right, you know. We shall soon have them on the run. I only hope I shall come in for something." He felt elated, sorry, tremendously important, all at once. This would show Uncle Soames and all the Forsytes how to be sportsmen. He had certainly done something heroic and exceptional in giving his age as 21. Emily's voice brought him back to earth. "You mustn't have a second glass, James. Warmson." "Won't they be astonished at Timothy's?" burst out Imogen. "I would give anything to see their faces. Do you have a sword, Val, or only a pop-gun?" "What made you?" His uncle's voice produced a slight chill in the pit of Val's stomach. Made him? How answer that? He was grateful for his grandmother's comfortable, "Well, I think it's very plucky of Val. I am sure he will make a splendid soldier. He is just the figure for it. We shall all be proud of him." "What had young Jolly Forsyte to do with it? Why did you go together?" pursued Soames, uncannily relentless. "I thought you weren't friendly with him." "I am not," mumbled Val, "but I wasn't going to be beaten by him." He saw his uncle look at him quite differently, as if approving. His grandfather was nodding too, his grandmother tossing her head. They all approved of his not being beaten by that cousin of his. There must be a reason. Val was dimly conscious of some disturbing point outside his range of vision, as it might be, the unlocated centre of a cyclone. And staring at his uncle's face, he had a quite unaccountable vision of a woman with dark eyes, gold hair, and a white neck, who smelt nice and had pretty silken clothes, which he had liked feeling when he was quite small. By Jove, yes, Aunt Irene! She used to kiss him, and he had bitten her arm once, playfully, because he liked it so soft. His grandfather was speaking. "What is his father doing?" "He's away in Paris," Val said, staring at the very queer expression on his uncle's face, like that of a snarling dog. "Artists," said James. The word, coming from the very bottom of his soul, broke up the dinner. Opposite his mother in the cab going home, Val tasted the after-fruits of heroism, like medlars over-ripe. She only said, indeed, that he must go to his tailor's at once and have his uniform properly made, and not just put up with what they gave him. But he could feel that she was very much upset. It was on his lips to console her with the spoken thought that he would be out of the way of that beastly divorce, but the presence of Imogen, and the knowledge that his mother would not be out of the way, restrained him. He felt aggrieved that she did not seem more proud of him. When Imogen had gone to bed, he risked the emotional. "I am awfully sorry to have to leave you, Mother." "Well, I must make the best of it. We must try and get you a commission as soon as we can. Then you won't have to rough it so. Do you know any drill, Val?" "Not a scrap." I hope they won't worry you much. I must take you about to get the things tomorrow. Good night. Kiss me." With that kiss, soft and hot, between his eyes, and those words, "I hope they won't worry you much," in his ears, he sat down to a cigarette before a dying fire. The heat was out of him, the glow of cutting a dash. It was all a damned heart-aching bore. "I will be even with that chap Jolly," he thought, trailing up the stairs past the room where his mother was biting her pillow to smother a sense of desolation which was trying to make her sob. And soon only one of the diners at James' was awake, Soames, in his bedroom above his father's. So that fellow Jolyon was in Paris. What was he doing there? Hanging round Irene. The last report from Polteed had hinted that there might be something soon. Could it be this? That fellow, with his beard and his cursed amused way of speaking, son of the old man who had given him the nickname "Man of Property," and bought the fatal house from him. Soames had ever resented having had to sell the house at Robin Hill, never forgiven his uncle for having bought it, or his cousin for living in it. Reckless of the cold, he threw his window up and gazed out across the park. Bleak and dark the January night, little sound of traffic, a frost coming, bare trees, a star or two. "I will see Polteed tomorrow," he thought. "By God, I am mad, I think, to want her still. That fellow, if... no." End of Part 2, Section 27. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida. Part 2, Chapter 10 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Harnick. The Forsyte Saga, Volume 2, In Chancery by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 10, Death of the Dog Balthazar. Jolyon, who had crossed from Calais by night, arrived at Robin Hill on Sunday morning. He had sent no word beforehand, so walked up from the station, entering his domain by the coppice gate. Coming to the log seat fashioned out of an old fallen trunk, he sat down, first laying his overcoat on it. "Lumbago," he thought. "That is what love ends in, at my time of life." And suddenly Irene seemed very near, just as she had been that day of rambling at Fontainebleau, when they had sat on a log to eat their lunch. Hauntingly near. Odour drawn out of fallen leaves by the pale filtering sunlight soaked his nostrils. "I am glad it isn't spring," he thought. With the scent of sap and the song of birds and the bursting of the blossoms, it would have been unbearable. "I hope I shall be over it by then, old fool that I am." And, picking up his coat, he walked on into the field. He passed the pond and mounted the hill slowly. Near the top a hoarse barking greeted him. Up on the lawn above the fernery he could see his old dog Balthazar. The animal, whose dim eyes took his master for a stranger, was warning the world against him. Jolyon gave his special whistle. Even at that distance of 100 yards and more, he could see the dawning recognition in the obese brown-white body. The old dog got off his haunches, and his tail, close curled over his back, began a feeble, excited fluttering. He came waddling forward, gathered momentum, and disappeared over the edge of the fernery. Jolyon expected to meet him at the wicket gate, but Balthazar was not there, and, rather alarmed, he turned into the fernery. On his fat side, looking up with eyes already glazing, the old dog lay. "What is it, my poor old man?" cried Jolyon. Balthazar's curled and fluffy tail just moved. His filming eyes seemed saying, "I can't get up, master, but I am glad to see you." Jolyon knelt down. His eyes, very dimmed, could hardly see the slowly ceasing heave of the dog's side. He raised the head a little, very heavy. "What is it, dear man? Where are you hurt?" The tail fluttered once. The eyes lost the look of life. Jolyon passed his hands all over the inert, warm bulk. There was nothing. The heart had simply failed in that obese body from the emotion of his master's return. Jolyon could feel the muzzle, where a few whitish bristles grew, cooling already against his lips. He stayed for some minutes kneeling, with his hand beneath the stiffening head. The body was very heavy. When he bore it to the top of the field, leaves had drifted there, and he strewed it with a covering of them. There was no wind, and they would keep him from curious eyes until the afternoon. "I will bury him myself," he thought. 18 years had gone since he first went into the St. John's Wood house with that tiny puppy in his pocket. Strange that the old dog should die just now. Was it an omen? He turned at the gate to look back at that russet mound, then went slowly towards the house, very choky in the throat. June was at home. She had come down hotfoot on hearing the news of Jolly's enlistment. His patriotism had conquered her feeling for the birds. The atmosphere of his house was strange and pockety when Jolyon came in and told them of the dog Balthazar's death. The news had a unifying effect. A link with the past had snapped. The dog Balthazar. Two of them could remember nothing before his day. To June he represented the last years of her grandfather. To Jolyon that life of domestic stress and aesthetic struggle before he came again into the kingdom of his father's love and wealth. And he was gone. In the afternoon he and Jolly took picks and spades and went out to the field. They chose a spot close to the russet mound so that they need not carry him far, and carefully cutting off the surface turf, began to dig. They dug in silence for 10 minutes, and then rested. "Well, old man," said Jolyon, "so you thought you ought." "Yes," answered Jolly, "I don't want to a bit, of course." How exactly those words represented Jolyon's own state of mind. "I admire you for it, old boy. I don't believe I should have done it at your age. Too much of a Forsyte, I'm afraid. But I suppose the type gets thinner with each generation. Your son, if you have one, may be a pure altruist. Who knows? He won't be like me then, Dad. I am beastly selfish." "No, my dear, that you clearly are not." Jolly shook his head, and they dug again. "Strange life, a dog's," said Jolyon suddenly. "The only four-footer with rudiments of altruism and a sense of God." Jolly looked at his father. "Do you believe in God, Dad? I have never known." At so searching a question from one to whom it was impossible to make a light reply, Jolyon stood for a moment feeling his back tried by the digging. "What do you mean by God?" he said. "There are two irreconcilable ideas of God. There is the unknowable creative principle. One believes in that. And there is the sum of altruism in man. Naturally, one believes in that." "I see. That leaves out Christ, doesn't it?" Jolyon stared. Christ, the link between those two ideas. Out of the mouths of babes. Here was orthodoxy scientifically explained at last. The sublime poem of the Christ life was man's attempt to join those two irreconcilable conceptions of God. And since the sum of human altruism was as much a part of the unknowable creative principle as anything else in nature and the universe, a worse link might have been chosen after all. Funny how one went through life without seeing it in that sort of way. "What do you think, old man?" he said. Jolly frowned. "Of course, my first year we talked a good bit about that sort of thing, but in the second year one gives it up. I don't know why. It is awfully interesting." Jolyon remembered that he also had talked a good deal about it, his first year at Cambridge, and given it up in his second. "I suppose," said Jolly, "it is the second God you mean that old Balthazar had a sense of." "Yes, or he would never have burst his poor old heart because of something outside himself." "But wasn't that just selfish emotion, really?" Jolyon shook his head. "No, dogs are not pure Forsytes. They love something outside themselves." Jolly smiled. "Well, I think I am one," he said. "You know, I only enlisted because I dared Val Dartie to." "But why?" "We barred each other," said Jolly shortly. "Ah," muttered Jolyon. So the feud went on to the third generation. This modern feud which had no overt expression. "Shall I tell the boy about it?" he thought. But to what end, if he had to stop short of his own part? And Jolly thought, it is for Holly to let him know about that chap. If she doesn't, it means she doesn't want him told, and I should be sneaking. Anyway, I have stopped it. I should better well leave alone. So they dug on in silence till Jolyon said, "Now, old man, I think it is big enough." And resting on their spades, they gazed down into the hole, where a few leaves had drifted already on a sunset wind. "I can't bear this part of it," said Jolyon suddenly. "Let me do it, Dad. He never cared much for me." Jolyon shook his head. "We will lift him very gently, leaves and all. I would rather not see him again. I will take his head, now." With extreme care they raised the old dog's body, whose faded tan and white showed here and there under the leaves stirred by the wind. They laid it, heavy, cold, and unresponsive, in the grave, and Jolly spread more leaves over it, while Jolyon, deeply afraid to show emotion before his son, began quickly shoveling the earth onto that still shape. There went the past. if only there were a joyful future to look forward to. It was like stamping down earth on one's own life. They replaced the turf carefully on the smooth little mound, and, grateful that they had spared each other's feelings, returned to the house arm in arm. End of Part 2, Chapter 10. Death of the dog Balthazar. Recording by Eva Harnick.
Part 2, Chapter 11 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2, In Chancery, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 11. Timothy Stays the Rot. On Forsyte 'Change, news of the enlistment spread fast, together with the report that June, not to be outdone, was going to become a Red Cross nurse. These events were so extreme, so subversive of pure Forsyteism, as to have a binding effect upon the family, and Timothy's was thronged next Sunday afternoon by members trying to find out what they thought about it all, and exchange with each other a sense of family credit. Giles and Jessie Hayman would no longer defend the coast, but go to South Africa quite soon. Jolly and Val would be following in April. As to June, well, you never knew what she would really do. The retirement from Spion Kop, and the absence of any good news from the seat of war, imparted an air of reality to all this, clinched in startling fashion by Timothy. The youngest of the old Forsytes, scarcely 80, in fact popularly supposed to resemble their father, Superior Dosset, even in his best-known characteristic of drinking sherry, had been invisible for so many years that he was almost mythical. A long generation had elapsed since the risks of a publisher's business had worked on his nerves at the age of 40, so that he had got out with a mere £35,000 in the world, and started to make his living by careful investment. Putting by every year at compound interest, he had doubled his capital in 40 years, without having once known what it was like to shake in his shoes over money matters. He was now putting aside some 2,000 a year, and with the care that he was taking of himself, expected, so Aunt Hester said, to double his capital again before he died. What he would do with it then, with his sisters dead and himself dead, was often mockingly queried by free spirits such as Francie, Euphemia, or young Nicholas's second, Christopher, whose spirit was so free that he had actually said he was going on the stage. All admitted, however, that this was best known to Timothy himself, and possibly to Soames, who never divulged a secret. Those few Forsytes who had seen him reported a man of thick and robust appearance, not very tall, with a brown-red complexion, grey hair, and little of the refinement of feature with which most of the Forsytes had been endowed by Superior Dosset's wife, a woman of some beauty and a gentle temperament. It was known that he had taken a surprising interest in the war, sticking flags into a map ever since it began, and there was uneasiness as to what would happen if the English were driven into the sea, when it would be almost impossible for him to put the flags in the right places. As to his knowledge of family movements, or his views about them, little was known, save that Aunt Hester was always declaring that he was very upset. It was, then, in the nature of a portent when Forsytes, arriving on the Sunday after the evacuation of Spion Kop, became conscious, one after the other, of a presence seated in the only really comfortable armchair, back to the light, concealing the lower part of his face with a large hand, and were greeted by the awed voice of Aunt Hester. "Your Uncle Timothy, my dear." Timothy's greeting to them all was somewhat identical, and rather, as it were, passed over by him than expressed. "How-de-do? How-de-do? Excuse me getting up." Francie was present, and Eustace had come in his car. Winifred had brought Imogen. breaking the ice of the restitution proceedings with the warmth of family appreciation at Val's enlistment, and Marion Tweetyman with the last news of Giles and Jessie. These, with Aunt Juley and Hester, young Nicholas, Euphemia, and, of all people, George, who had come with Eustace in the car, constituted an assembly worthy of the family's palmiest days. There was not one chair vacant in the whole of the little drawing-room, and anxiety was felt lest someone else should arrive. The constraint caused by Timothy's presence having worn off a little, conversation took a military turn. George asked Aunt Juley when she was going out with the Red Cross, almost reducing her to a state of gaiety, whereon he turned to Nicholas and said, "Young Nick's a warrior bold, isn't he? When's he going to don the wild khaki?" Young Nicholas, smiling with a sort of sweet deprecation, intimated that of course his mother was very anxious. "The Dromios are off, I hear," said George, turning to Marion Tweetyman. "We shall all be there soon. En avant, the Forsytes. Roll, bowl, or pitch. Who's for a cooler?" Aunt Juley gurgled. George was so droll. Should Hester get Timothy's map? Then he could show them all where they were. At a sound from Timothy, interpreted as assent, Aunt Hester left the room. George pursued his image of the Forsyte advance, addressing Timothy as Field Marshal, and Imogen, whom he had noted at once for a pretty filly, as vivandière, and holding his top hat between his knees he began to beat it with imaginary drumsticks. The reception accorded to his fantasy was mixed. All laughed. George was licensed. But all felt that the family was being rotted, and this seemed to them unnatural, now that it was going to give 5 of its members to the service of the Queen. George might go too far, and there was relief when he got up, offered his arm to Aunt Juley, marched up to Timothy, saluted him, kissed his aunt with mock passion, said, "Oh, what a treat! Dear papa! Come on, Eustace!" and walked out, followed by the grave and fastidious Eustace, who had never smiled. Aunt Juley's bewildered "Fancy not waiting for the map! You mustn't mind him, Timothy, he's so droll," broke the hush, and Timothy removed the hand from his mouth. "I don't know what things are coming to," he was heard to say. "What's all this about going out there? That's not the way to beat those Boers." Francie alone had the hardihood to observe, "What is then, Uncle Timothy?" "All this new-fangled volunteering and expense, letting money out of the country." Just then Aunt Hester brought in the map, handling it like a baby with eruptions. With the assistance of Euphemia, it was laid on the piano, a small Colwood grand, last played on, it was believed, the summer before Aunt Ann died, 13 years ago. Timothy rose. He walked over to the piano and stood looking at his map while they all gathered round. "There you are," he said. "That's the position up to date, and very poor it is. "Yes," said Francie, greatly daring. "But how are you going to alter it, Uncle Timothy, without more men?" "Men?" said Timothy. "You don't want men, wasting the country's money. You want a Napoleon. He'd settle it in a month." "But if you haven't got him, Uncle Timothy?" "That's their business," replied Timothy. "What have we kept the army up for? To eat their heads off in time of peace? They ought to be ashamed of themselves, coming on the country to help them like this. Let every man stick to his business, and we shall get on." And looking round him, he added almost angrily, "Volunteering indeed! Throwing good money after bad! We must save, conserve energy. That's the only way." And with a prolonged sound, not quite a sniff and not quite a snort, he trod on Euphemia's toe and went out, leaving a sensation and a faint scent of barley sugar behind him. The effect of something said with conviction by one who has evidently made a sacrifice to say it is ever considerable, and the 8 Forsytes left behind, all women except young Nicholas, were silent for a moment round the map. Then Francie said, "Really, I think he's right, you know. After all, what is the army for? They ought to have known. It's only encouraging them." "My dear," cried Aunt Juley, "but they've been so progressive. Think of their giving up their scarlet. They were always so proud of it. And now they all look like convicts. Hester and I were saying only yesterday we were sure they must feel it very much. Fancy what the Iron Duke would have said." "The new colour's very smart," said Winifred. "Val looks quite nice in his." Aunt Juley sighed. "I do so wonder what Jolyon's boy is like. To think we've never seen him. His father must be so proud of him." "His father's in Paris," said Winifred. Aunt Hester's shoulder was seen to mount suddenly, as if to ward off her sister's next remark, for Juley's crumpled cheeks had gushed. "We had dear little Mrs. MacAnder here yesterday, just back from Paris, and whom do you think she saw there in the street? You'll never guess." "We shan't try, Auntie," said Euphemia. "Irene! Imagine, after all this time, walking with a fair beard." "Auntie, you'll kill me. A fair beard?" "I was going to say," said Aunt Juley severely, "a fair bearded gentleman. And not a day older. She was always so pretty," she added, with a sort of lingering apology. "Oh, tell us about her, Auntie," cried Imogen. "I can just remember her. She's the skeleton in the family cupboard, isn't she? And they're such fun." Aunt Hester sat down. Really, Juley had done it now. "She wasn't much of a skeleton as I remember her," murmured Euphemia. "Extremely well covered." "My dear," said Aunt Juley, "what a peculiar way of putting it. Not very nice." "No, but what was she like?" persisted Imogen. "I'll tell you, my child," said Francie. "A kind of modern Venus, very well dressed." Euphemia said sharply: "Venus was never dressed, and she had blue eyes of melting sapphire." At this juncture Nicholas took his leave. "Mrs. Nick is awfully strict," said Francie, with a laugh. "She has 6 children," said Aunt Juley. "It's very proper that she should be careful." "Was Uncle Soames awfully fond of her?" pursued the inexorable Imogen, moving her dark luscious eyes from face to face. Aunt Hester made a gesture of despair, just as Aunt Juley answered: "Yes, your Uncle Soames was very much attached to her." "I suppose she ran off with someone?" "No, certainly not. That is, not precisely." "What did she do then, Auntie?" "Come along, Imogen," said Winifred. "We must be getting back." But Aunt Juley interjected resolutely: She didn't behave at all well." "Oh, bother!" cried Imogen. "That's as far as I ever get." "Well, my dear," said Francie, "she had a love affair which ended with the young man's death, and then she left your uncle. I always rather liked her." "She used to give me chocolates," murmured Imogen, "and smell nice." "Of course," remarked Euphemia. "Not of course at all," replied Francie, who used a particularly expensive essence of gillyflower herself. "I can't think what we are about," said Aunt Juley, raising her hands, "talking of such things." "Was she divorced?" asked Imogen from the door. "Certainly not," cried Aunt Juley. "That is, certainly not." A sound was heard over by the far door. Timothy had re-entered the back drawing-room. "I've come for my map," he said. "Who's been divorced?" "No one, Uncle," replied Francie with perfect truth. Timothy took his map off the piano. "Don't let's have anything of that sort in the family," he said. "All this enlisting's bad enough. The country's breaking up. I don't know what we're coming to." He shook a thick finger at the room. "Too many women nowadays, and they don't know what they want." So saying, he grasped the map firmly with both hands and went out as if afraid of being answered. The 7 women whom he had addressed broke into a subdued murmur, out of which emerged Francie's "Really, the Forsytes!" and Aunt Juley's "He must have his feet in mustard and hot water to-night, Hester. Will you tell Jane? The blood has gone to his head again, I'm afraid." That evening, when she and Hester were sitting alone after dinner, she dropped a stitch in her crochet and looked up. "Hester, I can't think where I've heard that dear Soames wants Irene to come back to him again. Who was it told us that George had made a funny drawing of him with the words, 'He won't be happy till he gets it'?" "Eustace," answered Aunt Hester from behind the Times. "He had it in his pocket, but he wouldn't show it us." Aunt Juley was silent, ruminating. The clock ticked, the Times crackled, the fire sent forth its rustling purr. Aunt Juley dropped another stitch. "Hester," she said, "I have had such a dreadful thought." "Then don't tell me," said Aunt Hester quickly. "Oh, but I must. You can't think how dreadful." Her voice sank to a whisper. "Jolyon, they say, has a fair beard now." End of Part 2, Chapter 11. Chapter 12 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by and Deminter. The Forsyte Saga 2. In Chancery. By John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 12. Progress of the Chase. 2 days after the dinner at James's, Mr. Polteed provided Soames with food for thought. "A gentleman," he said, consulting the key concealed in his left hand, 47 as we say, "has been paying marked attention to 17 during the last month in Paris, but at present there seems to have been nothing very conclusive. The meetings have all been in public places, without concealment: restaurants, the Opera, the Comique, the Louvre, Luxembourg Gardens, lounge of the hotel, and so forth. She has not yet been traced to his rooms, nor vice versa. They went to Fontainebleau, but nothing of value. In short, the situation is promising, but requires patience." And looking up suddenly, he added, "One rather curious point: 47 has the same name as 31. The fellow knows I'm her husband," thought Soames. "A Christian name, an odd one, a Jolyon," continued Mr. Polteed. "We know his address in Paris and his residence here. We don't wish, of course, to be running a wrong hare." "Go on with it, but be careful," said Soames doggedly. Instinctive certainty that this detective fellow had fathomed his secret made him all the more reticent. "Excuse me," said Mr. Polteed, "I'll just see if there is anything fresh in." He returned with some letters. Relocking the door, he glanced at the envelopes. "Yes, here's a personal one from 19 to myself." "Well?" said Soames. Said Mr. Polteed. "She says, 47 left for England today. Address on his baggage, Robin Hill. Parted from 17 in Louvre Gallery at 3:30. Nothing very striking. Thought it best to stay and continue observation of 17. You will deal with 47 in England if you think desirable, no doubt." And Mr. Polteed lifted an unprofessional glance on Soames, as though he might be storing material for a book on human nature after he had gone out of business. "Very intelligent woman, 19, and a wonderful make-up. Not cheap, but earns her money well. There's no suspicion of being shadowed so far, but after a time, as you know, sensitive people are liable to get the feeling of it without anything definite to go on. I should rather advise letting up on 17 and keeping an eye on 47. We can't get at correspondence without great risk. I hardly advise that at this stage, but you can tell your client that it's looking up very well." And again his narrowed eyes gleamed at his taciturn customer. "No," said Soames suddenly, "I prefer that you should keep the watch going discreetly in Paris, and not concern yourself with this end." "Very well," replied Mr. Polteed, "we can do it." What is the manner between them?" "I'll read you what she says," said Mr. Polteed, unlocking a bureau drawer and taking out a file of papers. She sums it up somewhere confidentially. Yes, here it is. 17, very attractive. Conclude 47, longer in the tooth. Slang for age, you know. Distinctly gone, waiting his time. 17, perhaps holding off for terms. Impossible to say without knowing more, but inclined to think, on the whole, doesn't know her mind. Likely to act on impulse some day. Both have style. What does that mean? Said Soames between closed lips. Well, murmured Mr. Polteed with a smile, showing many white teeth, an expression we use. In other words, it's not likely to be a week-end business. They come together seriously or not at all. Muttered Soames. That's all, is it? Yes, said Mr. Polteed, but quite promising. Spider, thought Soames. Good day. He walked into the Green Park that he might cross to Victoria Station and take the Underground into the city, for so late in January it was warm. Sunlight through the haze sparkled on the frosty grass, an illumined cobweb of a day. Little spiders and great spiders, and the greatest spinner of all, his own tenacity, for ever wrapping its cocoon of threads round any clear way out. What was that fellow hanging around Irene for? Was it really as Polteed suggested? Or was Jolyon but taking compassion on her loneliness, as he would call it, sentimental, radical chap that he had always been? If it were, indeed, as Polteed hinted, Soames stood still. It could not be. The fellow was 7 years older than himself, no better looking, no richer. What attraction had he? Besides, he's come back, he thought. That doesn't look... I'll go and see him. And taking out a card, he wrote: If you can spare half an hour some afternoon this week, I shall be at the Connoisseurs any day between 5:30 and 6, or I could come to the Hotchpotch if you prefer it. I want to see you. S.F. He walked up St. James's Street and confided it to the porter at the Hotchpotch. Give Mr. Jolyon Forsyte this as soon as he comes in, he said, and took one of the new motor cabs into the city. Jolyon received that card the same afternoon, and turned his face towards the Connoisseurs. What did Soames want now? Had he got wind of Paris? And stepping across St. James's Street, he determined to make no secret of his visit. But it won't do, he thought, to let him know she's there, unless he knows already. In this complicated state of mind he was conducted to where Soames was drinking tea in a small bay window. "No tea, thanks," said Jolyon, "but I'll go on smoking, if I may." The curtains were not yet drawn, though the lamps outside were lighted. The two cousins sat waiting on each other. "You've been in Paris, I hear," said Soames at last. "Yes, just back." "Young Val told me. He and your boy are going off, then?" Jolyon nodded. "You didn't happen to see Irene, I suppose? It appears she's abroad somewhere." Jolyon wreathed himself in smoke before he answered. "Yes, I saw her." "How was she?" "Very well." There was another silence. Then Soames roused himself in his chair. "When I saw you last," he said, "I was in two minds. We talked, and you expressed your opinion. I don't wish to reopen that discussion. I only wanted to say this. My position with her is extremely difficult. I don't want you to go using your influence against me. What happened is a very long time ago. I'm going to ask her to let bygones be bygones." "You have asked her, you know," murmured Jolyon. "The idea was new to her then. It came as a shock. But the more she thinks of it, the more she must see that it's the only way out for both of us." "That's not my impression of her state of mind," said Jolyon with particular calm. "And, forgive me saying, you misconceive the matter if you think reason comes into it at all." He saw his cousin's pale face grow paler. He had used, without knowing it, Irene's own words. "Thanks," muttered Soames, "but I see things perhaps more plainly than you think. I only want to be sure that you won't try to influence her against me." "I don't know what makes you think I have any influence," said Jolyon, "but if I have, I'm bound to use it in the direction of what I think is her happiness. I am what they call a feminist, I believe." "Feminist?" repeated Soames, as if seeking to gain time. "Does that mean you're against me?" "Bluntly," said Jolyon, "I'm against any woman living with any man whom she definitely dislikes. It appears to me rotten." "And I suppose each time you see her you put your opinions into her mind?" "I'm not likely to be seeing her." "Not going back to Paris?" "Not so far as I know," said Jolyon, conscious of the intent watchfulness in Soames's face. "Well, that's all I had to say. Anyone who comes between man and wife, you know, incurs heavy responsibility." Jolyon rose and made a slight bow. "Good-bye," he said, without offering to shake hands, moved away, leaving Soames staring after him. "We Forsytes," thought Jolyon, hailing a cab, "are very civilised. With simpler folk that might have come to a row. If it weren't for my boy going to the war... the war..." A gust of his old doubt swept over him. A precious war! Domination of peoples or of women, attempts to master and possess those who did not want you, the negation of gentle decency, possession, vested rights, and anyone agin 'em outcast. Thank Heaven, he thought, I always felt agin 'em anyway. Yes, even before his first disastrous marriage he could remember fuming over the bludgeoning of Ireland, or the matrimonial suits of women trying to be free of men they loathed. Parsons would have it that freedom of soul and body were quite different things. Pernicious doctrine that! Body and soul could not thus be separated. Free will was the strength of any tie, and not its weakness. I ought to have told Soames, he thought, that I think him comic. Ah, but he's tragic too. Was there anything indeed more tragic in the world than a man enslaved by his own possessive instinct, who couldn't see the sky for it, or even enter fully into what another person felt? I must write and warn her, he thought. He's going to have another try. And all the way home to Robin Hill he rebelled at the strength of that duty to his son which prevented him from posting back to Paris. But Soames sat long in his chair, the prey of a no less gnawing ache, a jealous ache, as if it had been revealed to him that this fellow held precedence of himself, and had spun fresh threads of resistance to his way out. "Does that mean that you're against me?" He had got nothing out of that disingenuous question. Feminist! Phrasy fellow! I mustn't rush things, he thought. I have some breathing space. He's not going back to Paris, unless he was lying. I'll let the spring come. Though how the spring could serve him, save by adding to his ache, he could not tell. And gazing down into the street, where figures were passing from pool to pool of light from the high lamps, he thought, nothing seems any good, nothing seems worth while. I'm lonely, that's the trouble. He closed his eyes, and at once he seemed to see Irene in a dark street below a church, passing, turning her neck so that he caught the gleam of her eyes and her white forehead under a little dark hat, which had gold spangles on it and a veil hanging down behind. He opened his eyes, so vividly had he seen her. A woman was passing below, but not she. No, no, there was nothing there. End of Part 2, Chapter 12. Part 2, Chapter 13 of In Chancery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga 2. In Chancery by John Galsworthy. Part 2. Chapter 13. Here we are again. Imogen's frocks for her first season exercised the judgment of her mother and the purse of her grandfather all through the month of March. With Forsyte tenacity, Winifred quested for perfection. It took her mind off the slowly approaching rite, which would give her a freedom but doubtfully desired. Took her mind, too, off her boy and his fast approaching departure for a war from which the news remained disquieting. Like bees busy on summer flowers, or bright gadflies hovering and darting over spiky autumn blossoms, she and her little daughter, tall nearly as herself and with a bust measurement not far inferior, hovered in the shops of Regent Street, the establishments of Hanover Square and of Bond Street, lost in consideration and the feel of fabrics. Dozens of young women of striking deportment and peculiar gait paraded before Winifred and Imogen, draped in "creations." The models, "Very new, madam, quite the latest thing," which those two reluctantly turned down, would have filled a museum. The models which they were obliged to have nearly emptied James's bank. It was no good doing things by halves, Winifred felt, in view of the need for making this first and sole untarnished season a conspicuous success. Their patience, in trying the patience of those impersonal creatures who swam about before them, could alone have been displayed by such as were moved by faith. It was for Winifred a long prostration before her dear goddess Fashion, fervent as a Catholic might make before the Virgin. For Imogen, an experience by no means too unpleasant. She often looked so nice, and flattery was implicit everywhere. In a word, it was amusing. On the afternoon of the 20th of March, having, as it were, gutted skywards, they had sought refreshment over the way at Caramel and Baker's, and stored with chocolate frothed at the top with cream, turned homewards through Berkeley Square, of an evening touched with spring. Opening the door, freshly painted a light olive green, nothing neglected that year to give Imogen a good send-off, Winifred passed towards the silver basket to see if anyone had called, and suddenly her nostrils twitched. What was that scent? Imogen had taken up a novel sent from the library, and stood absorbed. Rather sharply, because of the queer feeling in her breast, Winifred said, "Take that up, dear, and have a rest before dinner." Imogen, still reading, passed up the stairs. Winifred heard the door of her room slammed to, and drew a long savouring breath. Was it spring tickling her senses, whipping up nostalgia for her clown, against all wisdom and outraged virtue? A male scent, a faint reek of cigars and lavender water, not smelt since that early autumn night 6 months ago, when she had called him the limit. Whence came it? Or was it the ghost of scent, sheer emanation from memory? She looked round her. Nothing, not a thing, no tiniest disturbance of her hall nor of the dining room. A little daydream of a scent, illusory, saddening, silly. In the silver basket were 2 new cards, 2 with Mr. and Mrs. Polegate Tom, and 1 with Mr. Polegate Tom thereon. She sniffed them, but they smelt severe. I must be tired, she thought. I'll go and lie down. Upstairs, the drawing-room was darkened, waiting for some hand to give it evening light, and she passed on up to her bedroom. This too was half curtained and dim, for it was 6 o'clock. Winifred threw off her coat. That scent again! Then stood as if shot, transfixed against the bed-rail. Something dark had risen from the sofa in the far corner. A word of horror, in her family, escaped her. God! "It is I, Monty," said a voice. Clutching the bed-rail, Winifred reached up and turned the switch of the light hanging above her dressing-table. He appeared just on the rim of the light's circumference, emblazoned from the absence of his watch-chain down to boots, neat and sooty brown, but, yes, split at the toe-cap. His chest and face were shadowy. Surely he was thin, or was it a trick of the light? He advanced, lighted now from toe-cap to the top of his dark head, surely a little grizzled. His complexion had darkened, sallowed, his black moustache had lost boldness, become sardonic. There were lines which she did not know about his face. There was no pin in his tie. His suit, she knew that. But how unpressed, unglossy! She stared again at the toe cap of his boot. Something big and relentless had been at him, had turned and twisted, raked and scraped him. And she stayed, not speaking, motionless, staring at that crack across the toe. "Well," he said, "I got the order. I'm back." Winifred's bosom began to heave. The nostalgia for her husband, which had rushed up with that scent, was struggling with a deeper jealousy than any she had felt yet. There he was, a dark and as if harried shadow of his sleek and brazen self. What force had done this to him, squeezed him like an orange to its dry rind? That woman! "I'm back," he said again. "I've had a beastly time. By God, I came steerage. I've got nothing but what I stand up in, and that bag." "And who has the rest?" cried Winifred, suddenly alive. "How dared you come? You knew it was just for divorce that you got that order to come back. Don't touch me." They held each to the rail of the big bed where they had spent so many years of nights together. Many times, yes, many times she had wanted him back. But now that he had come, she was filled with this cold and deadly resentment. He put his hand up to his moustache, but did not frizz and twist it in the old familiar way. He just pulled it downwards. "Gad," he said, "if you knew the time I've had! I'm glad I don't. Are the kids all right?" Winifred nodded. "How did you get in?" "With my key." "Then the maids don't know. You can't stay here, Monty." He uttered a little sardonic laugh. "Where then?" "Anywhere." "Well, look at me. That damned—" "If you mention her," cried Winifred, "I go straight out to Park Lane, and I don't come back." Suddenly he did a simple thing, but so uncharacteristic that it moved her. He shut his eyes. It was as if he had said, "All right, I'm dead to the world." "You can have a room for the night," she said. "Your things are still there. Only Imogen is at home." He leant back against the bed rail. "Well, it's in your hands." And his own made a writhing movement. "I've been through it. You needn't hit too hard. It isn't worth while. I've been frightened. I've been frightened, Freddie." That old pet name, disused for years and years, sent a shiver through Winifred. "What am I to do with him?" she thought. "What in God's name am I to do with him? Got a cigarette?" She gave him one from a little box she kept up there for when she couldn't sleep at night, and lighted it. With that action, the matter-of-fact side of her nature came to life again. "Go and have a hot bath. I'll put some clothes out for you in the dressing-room. We can talk later." He nodded and fixed his eyes on her. They looked half dead. Or was it that the folds in the lids had become heavier? "He's not the same," she thought. "He never would be quite the same again. But what would he be?" "All right," he said, and went towards the door. He even moved differently, like a man who has lost illusion and doubts whether it is worth while to move at all. When he was gone and she heard the water in the bath running, she put out a complete set of garments on the bed in his dressing-room, then went downstairs and fetched up the biscuit box and whisky. Putting on her coat again and listening a moment at the bathroom door, she went down and out. In the street she hesitated. Past 7 o'clock. Would Soames be at his club or at Park Lane? She turned towards the latter. Back. Soames had always feared it. She had sometimes hoped it. Back. So like him, clown that he was, with this "here we are again," to make fools of them all, of the law, of Soames, of herself. Yet to have done with the law, not to have that murky cloud hanging over her and the children, what a relief! Ah, but how to accept his return? That woman had ravaged him, taken from him passion such as he had never bestowed on herself, such as she had not thought him capable of. There was the sting. That selfish, blatant clown of hers, whom she herself had never really stirred, had been swept and ungarnished by another woman. Insulting, too insulting, not right, not decent to take him back. And yet she had asked for him. The law, perhaps, would make her now. He was as much her husband as ever. She had put herself out of court. And all he wanted, no doubt, was money, to keep him in cigars and lavender water. That scent. After all, I'm not old, she thought. Not old yet. But that woman who had reduced him to those words, "I've been through it. I've been frightened, Freddie." She neared her father's house, driven this way and that, while all the time the Forsyte undertow was drawing her to deep conclusion that after all he was her property, to be held against a robbing world. And so she came to James's. "Mr. Soames? In his room." "I'll go up. Don't say I'm here." Her brother was dressing. She found him before a mirror, tying a black bow with an air of despising its ends. "Hello," he said, contemplating her in the glass. "What's wrong?" "Monty," said Winifred stonily. Soames spun round. "What?" "Back." "Hoist," muttered Soames, "with our own petard. Why the deuce didn't you let me try cruelty? I always knew it was too much risk this way." "Oh, don't talk about that. What shall I do?" Soames answered with a deep, deep sound. "Well?" said Winifred impatiently. "What has he to say for himself?" "Nothing. Nothing. One of his boots is split across the toe." Soames stared at her. "Ah," he said, "of course, on his beam ends. So it begins again. This'll about finish, father." "Can't we keep it from him?" "Impossible. He has an uncanny flair for anything that's worrying." And he brooded, with fingers hooked into his blue silk braces. "There ought to be some way in law," he muttered, "to make him safe." "No," cried Winifred, "I won't be made a fool of again. I'd sooner put up with him." The two stared at each other. Their hearts were full of feeling, but they could give it no expression, Forsytes that they were. "Where did you leave him?" "In the bath," and Winifred gave a little bitter laugh. "The only thing he's brought back is lavender water." "Steady," said Soames. "You're thoroughly upset. I'll go back with you." "What's the use?" "We ought to make terms with him." "Terms? It'll always be the same. When he recovers, cards and betting, drink and—" She was silent, remembering the look on her husband's face, the burnt child. "Perhaps." "Recovers?" replied Soames. "Is he ill?" "No, burnt out, that's all." Soames took his waistcoat from a chair and put it on. He took his coat and got into it. He scented his handkerchief with eau de cologne, threaded his watch chain, and said: "We haven't any luck." And in the midst of her own trouble, Winifred was sorry for him, as if in that little saying he had revealed deep trouble of his own. "I'd like to see mother," she said. "She'll be with father in their room. Come down quietly to the study. I'll get her." Winifred stole down to the little dark study, chiefly remarkable for a Canaletto too doubtful to be placed elsewhere, and a fine collection of law reports, unopened for many years. Here she stood, with her back to maroon-coloured curtains, close drawn, staring at the empty grate, till her mother came in, followed by Soames. "Oh, my poor dear," said Emily, "how miserable you look in here! This is too bad of him, really." As a family they had so guarded themselves from the expression of all unfashionable emotion that it was impossible to go up and give her daughter a good hug, but there was comfort in her cushioned voice, and her still dimpled shoulders under some rare black lace. Summoning pride and the desire not to distress her mother, Winifred said in her most off-hand voice: "It's all right, mother. No good fussing." "I don't see," said Emily, looking at Soames, Why Winifred shouldn't tell him that she'll prosecute him if he doesn't keep off the premises. He took her pearls, and if he's not brought them back, that's quite enough." Winifred smiled. They would all plunge about with suggestions of this and that, but she knew already what she would be doing, and that was nothing. The feeling that after all she had won a sort of victory, retained her property, was every moment gaining ground in her. No, if she wanted to punish him, she could do it at home, without the world knowing. "Well," said Emily, "come into the dining-room comfortably. You must stay and have dinner with us. Leave it to me to tell your father." And as Winifred moved towards the door, she turned out the light. Not till then did they see the disaster in the corridor. There, attracted by light from a room never lighted, James was standing, with his dun-covered camel-hair shawl folded about him, so that his arms were not free, and his silvered head looked cut off from his fashionably trousered legs, as if by an expanse of desert. He stood, inimitably stork-like, with an expression as if he saw before him a frog too large to swallow. "What's all this?" he said. "Tell your father? You never tell me anything." The moment found Emily without reply. It was Winifred who went up to him, and laying one hand on each of his swathed, helpless arms, said: "Monty's not gone bankrupt, father. He's only come back." They all three expected something serious to happen, and were glad that she had kept that grip of his arms. But they did not know the depth of root in that shadowy old Forsyte. Something wry occurred about his shaven mouth and chin, something scratchy between those long silvery whiskers. Then he said, with a sort of dignity: "He'll be the death of me. I knew how it would be." "You mustn't worry, father," said Winifred calmly. "I mean to make him behave." "Ah!" said James. "Here, take this thing off. I'm hot." They unwound the shawl. He turned and walked firmly to the dining-room. "I don't want any soup," he said to Warmson, and sat down in his chair. They all sat down too, Winifred still in her hat, while Warmson laid the fourth place. When he left the room, James said: "What's he brought back?" "Nothing, father." James concentrated his eyes on his own image in a tablespoon. "Divorce," he muttered. "Rubbish! What was I about? I ought to have paid him an allowance to stay out of England. Soames, you go and propose it to him." It seemed so right and simple a suggestion that even Winifred was surprised when she said: "No, I'll keep him now he's back. He must just behave, that's all." They all looked at her. It had always been known that Winifred had pluck. "Out there," said James elliptically, "who knows what cut-throats? You look for his revolver. Don't go to bed without. You ought to have Warmson to sleep in the house. I'll see him myself to-morrow." They were touched by this declaration, and Emily said comfortably: "That's right, James. We won't have any nonsense." "Ah!" muttered James darkly. "I can't tell." The advent of Warmson with fish diverted conversation. When, directly after dinner, Winifred went over to kiss her father good night, he looked up with eyes so full of question and distress that she put all the comfort she could into her voice. "It's all right, Daddy dear. Don't worry. I shan't need anyone. He's quite bland. I shall only be upset if you worry. Good night. Bless you." James repeated the words "bless you" as if he did not quite know what they meant, and his eyes followed her to the door. She reached home before 9 and went straight upstairs. Dartie was lying on the bed in his dressing-room, fully redressed in a blue serge suit and pumps. His arms were crossed behind his head, and an extinct cigarette drooped from his mouth. Winifred remembered ridiculously the flowers in her window boxes after a blazing summer day, the way they lay, or rather stood, parched, yet rested by the sun's retreat. It was as if a little dew had come already on her burnt-up husband. He said apathetically: "I suppose you've been to Park Lane? How's the old man?" Winifred could not help the bitter answer: "Not dead." He winced. Actually, he winced. "Understand, Monty," she said. "I will not have him worried. If you aren't going to behave yourself, you may go back. You may go anywhere. Have you had dinner?" "No." "Would you like some?" He shrugged his shoulders. "Imogen offered me some. I didn't want any." Imogen! In the plenitude of emotion Winifred had forgotten her. "So you've seen her? What did she say?" "She gave me a kiss." With mortification Winifred saw his dark sardonic face relaxed. "Yes," she thought, "he cares for her, not for me a bit." Dartie's eyes were moving from side to side. "Does she know about me?" he said. It flashed through Winifred that here was the weapon she needed. He minded their knowing. "No, Val knows. The others don't. They only know you went away." She heard him sigh with relief. "But they shall know," she said firmly, "if you give me cause." "All right," he muttered. "Hit me. I'm down." Winifred went up to the bed. "Look here, Monty, I don't want to hit you. I don't want to hurt you. I shan't allude to anything. I'm not going to worry. What's the use?" She was silent a moment. "I can't stand any more, though, and I won't. You'd better know. You've made me suffer, but I used to be fond of you. For the sake of that—" She met the heavy-lidded gaze of his brown eyes with the downward stare of her green-grey eyes, touched his hand suddenly, turned her back and went into her room. She sat there a long time before her glass, fingering her rings, thinking of this subdued, dark man, almost a stranger to her, on the bed in the other room, resolutely not worrying, but gnawed by jealousy of what he had been through, and now and again just visited by pity. End of Part 2, Chapter 13.